The spoken medium is so much better just naturally for having more constructive disagreement outcomes.
Maybe we can all figure this out and still be human, but I don't know, like, where are they going?
When do people engage in perspective taking as well as what we call like perspective getting?
Welcome back to I Can Fit That In, the show where ambition meets alignment. Today, I am joined by Juliana Schroeder, an award-winning professor at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. Juliana studies how people make social judgments and decisions, how we think about other people's minds, and how those assumptions shape our leadership, communication, and relationships. Her research has been featured in the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, and NPR, and she teaches leaders how to navigate influence, conflict, and human behavior with greater awareness. Juliana, thank you for being here. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited as well.
So this is the kind of stuff that when you and I first met, I'm like, this is my jam. Learning more about human behavior and how people think and decide and what really shapes behavior. So I thought a great place for us to start is to learn a little bit more about you and how did you get into this work?
That's a great question. I always knew that I wanted to do research, science research at some point. I thought I was going to be a chemist. That's what my interest in high school was. And then I got exposed to the social sciences when I got to college. I took a seminar in psychology and economics, and I was like, this is fascinating. Human behavior, the human mind, like this is the thing I'm really excited about. And so I just completely switched over. I never took another chemistry class. And I went into the social sciences. I did a thesis on the psychology of pain and how people judge their physical pain, which ended up not being a topic that was very central in my research later on, but always something I still think about because I think it's super interesting. And then I worked in econ consulting for a couple of years. And when I loved that, but it was too theoretical. I wanted something like more applied and I wanted more autonomy. And so I went back to grad school. That's when I started working with Nick Epley at the University of Chicago. And that's when I became really interested in social psychology and the inferences that we make about our social worlds and all of the friction that comes up in our social worlds and some of the challenges and how can we be more effective in creating more connected social life and also being more constructive in our disagreements. So we do a lot of work on negotiation and conflict. And I apply that to organizational settings. So that's how I ended up as a professor in a business school. So then I think about leadership and, things like that.
Yes. I mean, what an interesting journey that your career has taken you on. And this research must just be so fascinating. And, I'm very curious about the life of a researcher, which I know you can fill us in on throughout this conversation. A question I have off the bat about your research is that, you're looking at how we think about the minds of others, when it comes to social behavior and when it comes to decision making and things like that. So what would you say people get wrong about how they interpret others' intentions? And I would say, like, especially when it comes to like leadership or high stakes, high pressure type of environments.
Well, a central tenet of a lot of the work that we do is that people are egocentric. They're kind of bounded by their own perspectives. And so, on the one hand, I think that can help us in some of our social interactions because we do tend to just infer that others sometimes feel the same way that we do about things. And that's like a pretty reasonable baseline a lot of times. Humans do kind of have things that are the same across different contexts, but it also can lead us astray. And we often get, too taken up by our own perspective, and it's challenging. It takes effort, to be able to take someone else's perspective, and it takes attention, and we have to have adequate motivation. And so, like, a lot of what we study is, when do people engage in perspective taking, as well as what we call like perspective getting, which is a much better idea than perspective taking, because just trying to simulate someone else's perspective, accuracy on that is not always great. Like, there are lots of things where it's like we get it wrong. We're over focusing on ourselves and things like that. Perspective getting is a nice technique because you can just ask someone directly how they're feeling and thinking about something. And if you ask it in the right way, I mean, you have to think about how you frame that a little bit. You can actually get more insight that allows you to be more accurate from that. So that's a lot of what we're thinking about in my lab.
Yeah. And I mean, that to me sounds like it's a lot of kind of presence, presence with yourself and what you are thinking and feeling, but then also perception and understanding that how you portray that or what you exude is going to likely shape how people are perceiving you. So
Yeah.
on
One
that
one
note,
big phenomenon, just to like make it a little
yeah,
more concrete, that
yeah.
we've identified in some of our work is something we call like the lesser minds phenomenon. Yeah, so this one might be interesting to your listeners because there's a lot of contexts in which, and it comes back to the kind of egocentrism that I mentioned, where people, just because you tend to be very aware of what you're thinking and feeling all the time. I mean, people don't have perfect introspection, but that's just something that's naturally kind of on our minds. Then I think it makes us tend to believe that others are not always like thinking and feeling things quite as vividly as we are. And that leads to this thing where we call it lesser minds, that like people tend to think of others as having lesser mental capacities than they do. So whether it's like, oh, they're just not quite as thoughtful or rational or reasonable, especially if there's any signal that someone disagrees with you or takes a different perspective than you do on something, it's sort of easy for people to make these inferences that overgeneralize, where they're like, oh, well, they must not be thinking about this the right way. And if they're not thinking about that the right way, then maybe they're not thinking about other things the right way. And maybe they just lack mental faculties in all these ways. And so they kind of like quickly get to this like generalization that can be dehumanizing. And we find in disagreement that can actually work against you, because you tend to, without even knowing it, like as people are pretty quick to do it, they'll start kind of dehumanizing the counterpart and being like, oh, they're liberal, they're conservative, like they are an idiot. And people will say this in our surveys, they'll say like, they're not thinking about it carefully enough, or they're not motivated enough to get to the right information. Like me, I was able to find that. And for all these things, then you won't be able to engage as productively or constructively with the counterpart as soon as you start to have that reasoning.
Yeah, where my brain goes with listening to this lesser minds concept that you just shared, which is fascinating. It goes to unexamined assumptions that we make. And when we're making those assumptions, how much are those assumptions driving what helps someone or hinders someone from feeling truly seen and heard and respected in an interaction, right? So what do you
Mm-hmm.
see with that? I mean, what is it from a psychological standpoint that either helps or hinders helping people feel seen and heard?
Yeah, such a great question. So certainly, like just to kind of get into some of the details of what you think about, let's take like a disagreement conversation. So this is, the bread and butter of any negotiation, anything you're talking about where there's scarce resources and people have different preferences. It happens all the time, work, life, personal life. I negotiate with my husband every single day.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can I think about both the production and the consumption of content in a conversation. Okay, so like work with me on this framework. So the production would be like the words that are coming out of my mouth, as well as what I'm doing with my body language and my voice. So how I'm kind of couching that. The medium is also the message to you. And then there's the, your counterpart, your audience, how they're consuming that message. And so both of those things kind of work in conjunction for us to be able to find understanding and potentially reach a solution. And we find, of course, that, in terms of the production, so there's language that you can use that will signal to the counterpart that you're more open to hearing what they have to say and more willing to be able to get to some sort of agreement. And so we call it receptive language. And there's actually algorithms that we've built and other researchers, so Juliana and where they've identified what are the features of receptiveness. And they've identified certain things like showing agreement, their agreement terms, more positive emotion terms, fewer negative emotion terms, even hedging. Turns out, if you say, for example, in sometimes people say things in very definitive ways, like this is the fact. Other times they say, well, this is how I see it, or that's a way that signals that I'm a little more open to kind of hearing the way that you see it. There's an implication there. So that's like kind of some of the stuff we've been doing in terms of thinking about the language. And by the way, this is different from just politeness, right? Because it's
Yeah.
really like signaling that I'm interested in hearing what you have to say back.
Right.
Um, and there's a whole literature on this in the negotiation world too, like framing what you have to say in terms of your interests, like your underlying motives, as opposed to just positions, which tend to be intractable. So that's the language side. But then the consumption side is really interesting. And one of the things that we found is that going back to this, I just mentioned it briefly, like the medium is the message.
Mm-hmm.
The way in which, so the structure of the conversation itself, like the platform that it's happening on and the medium by which it's happening, whether it's, spoken versus written, those things beyond just the language are really changing the way the audience is able to consume what you have to say.
Yeah.
And let's just take like the most stark example. We just wrote this huge paper on this, speaking versus writing. Okay, so with all this new technology, all this new communication technology at our fingertips, which we're leveraging right now, which is great, there's a lot of online conversation happening that's very text-based, right? So a lot of disagreements are playing out in online forums. And, we found in our research that text-based communication, although it feels convenient and easy, and it's actually very appealing to people in disagreement contexts, because disagreement feels like emotionally charged and kind of like uncomfortable. It's one of those contexts, and we have a whole line of work we've done on social contexts like these, where people prefer to have a little bit of distance. They love writing because it allows them, 84% of people in our surveys, these are like nationally representative surveys, say that if they had to have a conversation with someone they disagree with, which by the way, they don't really want to do that, but if they had to, the medium that they would choose would be a written medium, rather than a spoken or even in person.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and they do that, I think, because it feels sort of easier. But they also are really more focused on the production of content side. So they're interested in like, well, when I write, I'll be able to polish it. I'll be able to edit it. I'll put it into an LLM, whatever LLM you want, and like it'll make it look beautiful and perfect. And then it'll be incredibly convincing and compelling to my counterpart, right? But what they're failing to think about enough, what we find in the research, is that the counterpart, when you are faced with a block of writing, even if it comes from an LLM, which does make the formatting more beautiful or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to read it. You don't have to engage with it. You can read one word of it.
Yeah.
You have so many choices in how you want to engage with that. Right.
Right.
And as the communicator, I've now lost control over how you, and then think also about the back and forth conversation piece. Even a synchronous written medium, like text messaging, has some lag in it, in which people are often kind of like, especially when they get passionate about things and the things are emotionally charged, I could write you a block of text and then you're writing me something. And are you really responding? Are we really engaging meaningfully with each other back and forth? Or are we writing past each other? Literally, just like writing blocks of text at the same time that aren't even engaging with each other. That happens all the time on written platforms, text-based platforms. And so what we find in this work is that the spoken medium is so much better just naturally for having more constructive disagreement outcomes. It leads to more understanding. So if you give people just 10 minutes to write, or we've even increased the amount of time that they have to write to each other. So maybe they have 20 minutes or 30 minutes because people write more slowly than they talk, compared to just even 10 minutes of spoken conversation. It doesn't even have to be video chat. It could be on the phone, as long as this is just two people right here. You see that there's so many better outcomes in the spoken conversations. They have more understanding. They report feeling like they have less conflict. They have higher impressions of each other by the time the conversation is over. You see a little bit more change in attitudes towards alignment. People are more likely to be able to reach an agreement if these are kind of less contentious disagreement conversations. Sometimes they can't reach agreement, especially in these short conversations. But you just see all these better outcomes. And what's crazy though is that people don't really recognize it. Like they'd rather be in the written medium.
Do you know what's really funny about what you're saying? I feel like it's, as technology is mediating more and more of our interactions, online,
Yeah.
I'm curious, like it's really changing the way that we're perceiving others and like their level of competence, but also perhaps their humanity, because the people who are doing more video content can feel more human. of course, I mean, that could change really quickly, right? With with generative AI. But at least right now, people think that if they use a LLM and they put something out on LinkedIn, for example, that is perfectly polished, that it shows this level of thought and competence. But it's like, how much is there like original thought in there and, authenticity to who they are as a human versus they just asked for something to be created and then they posted that. So what's your perspective on that as technology is mediating more of our interactions? How is it changing how we're perceiving competence and humanity?
Yeah, Erin, those are such great questions. So 10 years ago, when I came out on the academic job market, my job market paper was called the Humanizing Voice Hypothesis. And essentially we find that exactly as you're kind of intuiting, that voice tends to be more humanizing when you get content conveyed via the voice compared to even the exact same words in text. So, and we showed that it mattered for like job candidates, in jobs where mental competence is valued, so maybe more white collar kind of labor. And if recruiters, and we have recruiters in our experiments, if they hear what a job candidate has to say in their own voice, the job candidate's own voice, which matters, compared to reading the same words, they tend to think of that candidate as being more competent and more warm as well. So the emotional side of mental capacity judgments, and they're more interested in hiring them. And people don't intuit this either, right? They think that, a really well polished, beautiful piece of text will make them seem more competent. But I think the thing is that you can polish speech as well. I mean, people maybe don't think about that as much. I mean, now I think maybe people think more about it. But of course, you can like have a perfect elevator pitch that you've practiced. Now, the one caveat to those findings that I would mention is that it does matter what some of the features of the voice. So there is variance, of course. Accents. Some voices do sound more competent than others. I'm someone who doesn't think of myself as having that competent sounding of a voice, so I always think about this work a lot. But on average, you do get this effect overall with speaking versus texting. And then one thing that we did find that matters a lot is that things can become over practiced. So the thing about voice in particular that we think is really humanizing, at least historically has been humanizing, is that it has this variance to it. It sort of signals, it's closely linked to thought in a way, especially when it's online, because there's variance in pacing and tone. It signals that, you're having these thoughts in the moments that you're actually having them. And so it's sort of a strong signal of mind in that way. And so if a voice becomes too monotone, you can think about like kind of old robotic voices, like that series from way many versions back. They were like, very, very monotone. Those are, really kind of dehumanizing voices. And we actually didn't find that those types of like dehumanizing voices were judged more harshly than writing, but they were kind of at the same level. So it kind of like gets rid of the humanizing effect of voice. But I think you bring up a really great point now, which is that even though across many studies we did find this link that voice is kind of tightly tied to conceptions of humanness, now we're kind of in a world where you now are hearing AI generated voices that sound very human-like. They sound so good. And so we're tracking this and we're trying to see, how tight this kind of like link, this stereotype is that people have between a voice and humanness when it has kind of these natural human-like kind of features to it, like the variance and the pitch and pacing and things. And we're tracking it. We're going to see. We already have a paper that's coming out on these deepfake videos. So these are like videos that look really natural, but they're actually deepfaked. The communicator that's showing up in the video was like never actually presenting that video. Yeah, and so that technology has gotten really good as well, of course. And what we find in that paper is that when it's disclosed that was a deepfake video after someone has watched it and they didn't know, people have this like surprise experience, like, whoa. And what it does is it makes them doubt this whole idea that seeing is believing. It makes them doubt visual reality. And so what we find is that it's sort of like a hidden cost to disclosure. So on the one hand, I'm a big fan of like the transparency and even possibly the idea of like trying to regulate deepfake videos and making everyone disclose. But on the other hand, it does seem that like if it's not across the board that everything's being disclosed, which, on the internet, there's a lot of variants, and certainly things are like not being regulated consistently across the world right now. What you get is these kind of this potentially deleterious consequence that it really makes people doubt what truth is. They doubt visual reality, and they'll even say that real videos that they see after having seen a deepfake that was disclosed to them, they are more likely to say that real videos are likely to be false, right? So it's like they're kind of doubting everything.
Wow.
So as you know, we're kind of living in this post-truth world a little bit here, and I think what that does is it starts to get rid of the signal of veracity. And you might start seeing something like that with voices as well. So it might be that I'm not sure. Like, I think there's two different possibilities. So right now, so one might be that as AI generated voices become more and more common and sound more and more human-like, that people will they won't know anymore. It's like they will doubt anyone that they talk to over a phone or like something where they can't see them. And who knows, right? Because you can just imagine this is a sliding scale. People won't have that as a signal anymore, which makes it much harder to communicate effectively.
Yes.
But the alternative is that it might be like such a deeply ingrained belief that we have that it might stick around for a while, this kind of human voice kind of psychological connection that people make. And in that case, that opens up like another potentially dangerous set of consequences, which is that people might tend to anthropomorphize AI voices for a long time. That, you could imagine companies taking advantage of this, right?
Right.
So, if it's the case that you just naturally, humans can't help but like humanize AI generated voices because the voice is just so tightly linked with humanity in their minds, then that's something I think companies could take advantage of to sell us things. And so that's
interesting.
Yeah.
What comes up for me in listening to you, well, there's a lot of things. But one of the things that was coming up is that when it comes to tone and inflection in voice and kind of rhythms and intentional pauses, things like that, there's a lot of what I call endearing qualities of hearing someone speak freely, right? Where they're not scripted, they're not polished and poised, but they're speaking from their own thought. They're using their own human abilities to convey what it is that's on their mind. And I'm wondering if we're going to like lose that endearing quality of human connection in that way through our voice. And that's sort of where like one place my mind goes to. And the other place is how much does this affect like judgment and empathy and that part of our humanness and how we perceive others, like and how we perceive others and how we approach life, how we approach relationships. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a great question too. In general, we've found that voice tends to increase empathic accuracy. Like you're more accurate when you hear someone expressing through their voice the classic paradigm has been being able to judge people's emotional states as they self-report them having them. And people are better able to do that more accurately when they can hear voice than when they read text. But you can certainly imagine. So there's a lot of tools that are being built now that are kind of coaching people to have more empathic accuracy and show more empathy, and they're doing it via text-based channels. And I know voice coaching is happening as well. And on the one hand, I have some level of optimism about some of these tools because some of them are quite good. Again, we have like an algorithm for receptive language. And so you can just imagine you're writing an email. This is like a nice use case. And some of these tools are actually out there already and companies are developing them. And I'm in the Silicon Valley area right here at UC Berkeley. So we're working with tons of startups that are doing work on this. And so, you're writing an email and perhaps it's, a little emotionally charged. And imagine like right before you press send, you could get feedback from an AI, system that gives you information about your tone and maybe suggests some ways that you could update your language to be more receptive. You could even tell it your goals and it could, and perhaps, as long as you have agency in terms of what you are able to incorporate into your email, that could be helpful. Now, even there, for example, Gmail already has add-ins that kind of naturally, it has suggested language, right? And people have researched what that's done. And one of the things they found is that everyone's emails are becoming more positive, like their language is becoming more positive. And that's partly because of those algorithms. They're kind of like in play. Part of how they're working is that they do tend to support and suggest more language that is more positively coded. So that's just, it doesn't seem like a problematic consequence at this point, but it's kind of interesting to think that through. What I'm more concerned with, so I'm generally optimistic about some of these coaching programs, as long as they're nudges and they're built to like help humans learn how to communicate more effectively. What I'm more concerned about is programs and tools right now that could lead to social de-skilling because it does it for you. Right. And even the email one that I mentioned, you could imagine where it's like you just press a button and it's like fix this whole email and make it. And that's kind of more where LLMs are going at this. Like you press a button, it's a little easier, make everything sound amazing. I'm not even going to look at it again. Just send it out. Yeah, it's a little bit more where we're going. And of course, there's more money there and it feels easier. But the problem with this, and you can imagine that we're going to start outsourcing more and more. Like, why even have a disagreement conversation? Let's have my AI, talk to your AI and they can have a conversation. And we can just outsource it, It's
right.
just like, why even have a friend that won't be there 24/7 when I can have an AI friend that'll be there for me? Now, this stuff makes me, I feel very nervous about it. I'm very pessimistic about it because I think it's incredibly important for human relationships to be able to work through conflict yourself. I don't think we want to be outsourcing that. I think we want people to learn how to do that themselves because their relationships are going to suffer in the long run. And I think we need human relationships, even though they are obviously imperfect. An AI friend or an AI romantic partner, even worse. These things are becoming very popular. They're going to be great. They're going to be there for you all the time. They're literally built to serve you.
Right. But we are social creatures. So
Yeah.
so that, I mean, it is terrifying from that perspective. And I'm a mom of young boys and, problem solving and relationship building and communicating. Like these are things I work on with them, right? Like when we go to a restaurant, I'm like, look at the waiter or waitress, like in their eyes when you order, say please, say thank you, and they come to me with an issue they had at school. I'm not just going to go fix that for them. I'm like, what have you tried? Like, let's talk it through. Maybe you could try this. Have you thought about that? Like, this is like human stuff that people need to be able to do. And I think my one thing that keeps me up at night about all of this is our future generations and what their lives are like. I'm like, maybe we can all figure this out and still be human, but I don't know, like, where are they going? That absolutely terrifies me. I'd love to ask you, from your own, gosh, your research
I agree.
is so
And I
deep.
think you're such a good mom, by the way. I'll just
Thank you. I definitely try. I'm far from perfect, but your research is really deep and it's so fascinating. And I am curious from a personal perspective for you, like what are some of the tools you have in your own life that help you stay like deeply connected to your humanness and your relationships and your social capacity? Because you're in this stuff all day, every day, and you've seen a lot. So what are some of your practices or rituals?
Oh, great. I love this question. There is, so in addition to Silicon Valley, all these tech startups, there's also it's been interesting within San Francisco, there's like a huge IRL movement, like in real life. It's like, get back to real life. It's like the stop scrolling movement, like get into the world. And I am here for that. I'm here for that. And in my own life, I really, try to engage in a lot of digital hygiene. We're teaching this, huge class. Sahar Yusuf is the lead instructor. She's a cognitive neuroscientist here at UC Berkeley doing amazing things. It's called Minds, Machines, and Meaning. And it's, 500 undergrads are enrolled in it. And it's all about, how do we create a digital hygiene program that allows us to really take control of our digital tools. And, ultimately technology is, meant to serve us, right? And it is a tool. And so you can use it in effective ways. But at the same time, so that's the optimistic lens on it. And we can teach ourselves to be more intentional with these tools, and sometimes to leave them behind and go to IRL, like be in real life, and have in-person social interactions, because we know it's good for us in the long run. And, there's what we call like a short-term, long-term trade-off in all of these kind of social technologies, where it kind of feels good in the short term and it's easier and more efficient to like just press that button and like let it write everything for you and do all the hard work for you. And also it might feel kind of good to have an AI romantic partner that will sex with you on command and things like that. And but we also know that like in the long term, those things are not going to be like psychologically healthy for you. And so people really need to balance, and people kind of get that sense. They explicitly know that, they understand that, of course, but I think it becomes a self-control dilemma, because it's like the potato chip kale problem, where it's like, yes, I know like kale is good for me and I should have like a real life romantic partner, but if you put potato chips in front of me, like eventually I'll eat them. Like if they're just always around me, I will eat them. And so that's the thing with this, is the pessimistic side with a lot of technologies, that even though again, it's a tool that you can use for good, it is not built to really maximize your long-term psychological health, right? The money, if you think about the incentives and why VCs invest in certain companies, because they're looking for like a big multiplier. They are interested in putting in money for tools that are like designed to do things like maximize your short-term attention, right? Yeah. And this is what, the Center for Humane Technology, and I run the Psychology of Technology Institute. We've been doing like a ton of work on this to say, social media was designed to like put eyeballs on the screen. It'll do things that, are not good for your long-term health. It'll show you, terrible things you can't look away from. You don't want to see them, but it's an outrage machine, and so on. It's an attention vacuum. And so because of those things, you really have to like constantly be fighting against these tools and be really aware and cognizant of how they're affecting your psychology. And so that's what I really would see all your listeners. I hope that they'll really hear that message.
Absolutely. And I guess, that kind of leads me to one of my final questions I had for you. But, if people were to understand, well, clearly, I mean, you've actually done a ton of teaching too, not just research, right? So you're teaching MBAs and executives for years, and you see a lot. I'm sure you've seen so many patterns play out in people. But if there's one thing from your research that you have people apply right away, or that you want them to apply when they're in a classroom setting with you, and then they're going, back into their jobs, or they're leaving school to go into their job, what would you say is one thing that has really helped them lead others more effectively or efficiently, and maybe even more empathically?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll point to this idea of trying to think through the intimacy part of connection, and just think through like the more human aspect of it. And rather than always trying to maximize productivity or, getting the best possible outcome for yourself, like in the context for negotiations, you want to think about like developing long-term relationships and kind of thinking through the human element. And when you focus and frame things a little bit more that way, that moves you more to like what we call like a value creation mindset, where you're going to be more integrative and think through kind of the relationship again in the potential longer term. Almost every interaction we have with people, you're going to see them again in some way. We're kind of connected now all through this kind of small world online. And so you should always think about every interaction as being like potentially like a long-term relationship. And when you start, again, kind of framing things that way, you start to realize that, yeah, maybe technology and tech-mediated interaction is not always going to serve you. And so maybe having that more intimate, in-person conversation or voice-based conversation can really help you from like a leadership perspective. So I would love to leave people with that. And then I would also say that in people's like social lives, so this is outside of work, but also work is related to this, there's like a whole class of social interactions that we find, and there's this great book that's coming out on it. It's called A Little More Social by Nick Epley. He was my advisor in grad school. And what we find is that there's a whole class of social interactions that people have a little bit of a miscalibrated psychology on. And these are social interactions, and it seems to be getting worse, that feel a little bit uncomfortable. So it's like talking to strangers, having disagreements is a good one. But also things like giving unsolicited advice. Like that's, people see that as very taboo. Asking for a favor, like reconnecting with an old friend. Like there's all sorts of these types of interactions.
Yeah.
And we find that essentially in these cases, people tend to be a little bit overly concerned about either the role of norms, like what feels appropriate in the moment,
Mm.
what will seem appropriate for them, but and also overly concerned about how the other person might judge them or awkwardness. Like there's a whole set of things that they have concerns about. And what we find in our experiments, because we run tons of experiments on this, is that if you have people actually do this, like go talk to a stranger, go like, give someone some advice that you think would be helpful for them, even if they haven't asked. What we find is that it almost always goes better than people expect, and it
Mm.
leads them to have more happiness, and it kind of helps to build community. So there's this whole class of things that I think, people could be a little more social or pro-social on, and everyone would be a little bit better off. And so we're trying to really promote that idea and pitch that out to the world. And the book is a really great way to learn all about that psychology.
I love that. We will include the book in our show notes because I'm sure it's going to be so helpful for many, many people. And it brings me back to even just raising my boys, like having them I had one of them go into Whole Foods to get some eggs the other day. I'm like, I used to go into the gas station to pay for gas when I was a kid, like why can't they go into a grocery store to pay for something, and I'm waiting right out front. Like it's something as simple as that is actually making them be social. It's making them communicate with people when they otherwise don't have to, because it's easy for mom or dad just to go do it. And how can we as adults continue to put ourselves in situations where we are having, the disagreement, but we're doing it in a way where we are listening, but we're also, sharing our perspectives, right? How can we put ourselves in situations where we are negotiating from a place that isn't defensive, but is maybe trying to find some common ground or compromise for both sides? I feel like there's just so much to be learned on all of this, and yet we're scratching the surface because so much is changing so quickly. So thank you for walking us through a lot of your research and perspective on where this is all going and where it's come from, but how it's shifting. And I think that's the important thing for people to learn right now is it's shifting fast, and it's not going to stop, but there's ways that we can reframe, and there's ways that we can approach, relationships, being social, and, perceiving others from maybe new angles.
I agree. Thank
So
you so
thank
much.
you. Yes, Juliana, it was lovely to have you here, and we appreciate your time. And to all the listeners, we will include everything on where to find Juliana on LinkedIn, and also Nick Epley's book that she recommended. This will be in the show notes. And until next time, be well.